Due to unforeseen circumstances, Mr. Larry Warren could not be here today personally. Gary Heseltine, a big round of applause, please. Thank you very much.
You'll be pleased to know I'm not speaking for long. This is not my gig, but I just wanted to introduce a short video from somebody who was listed originally to speak here, along with Peter Robbins, co-author of Left the Escape. Due to circumstances beyond our control, he couldn't be here. So in a bit of magic, I kind of flew to Australia today, i.e. Glasgow, Australia, and recorded an interview with Larry Warren with a message for you today. So here we go, let's play the message. I'm with Larry Warren, and I think he has something to say to all the people who were waiting to hear from him today.
Well, hello everybody at the SPI conference in Glasgow. Sorry I can't be there to accept my Academy Award. I am in Australia, which is so familiar. It looks a little like Glasgow, but it's amazing how small this world is. But anyway, I just want to say I'm sorry I can't be with you. Thank the guys with the badges at the door, and I didn't bring my chainsaw, I promise. But you know what? I want to thank all the people that came all this way to see me and my co-author speak for the first time in over a decade. Fortunately, that ain't gonna happen. You know, I've been in this game for a long time, since I blew the whistle on Rendlesham Forest in 1982. You know, I'm not a self-styled or self-aggrandizing whistleblower. I'm the acknowledged whistleblower, and that's the word people are looking for. I did that, I'm proud of it. Kind of disappointed I got treated the way I did by ufology the last 35 years. I must love pain, but it was important to do, and I know what happened. Back in court, I've seen a lot of things played around. It is truly now the most toxic, you would think it'd be the most documented, which it is, UFO incident in history. Unfortunately, it has become really a window on the worst of humanity on every level. So I apologize for that. I should have kept my mouth shut all them years ago, like my family wanted me to. But I want to thank you for coming up. I'm sorry I missed all these great speakers today because there are a lot I wanted to see. Unfortunately, ufology is the subject or whatever is descended into a lot of politics where people on the internet that don't get out too much have a lot of time and apparently a lot of power to affect your opportunity to hear people speak. And also certain bodies, executive bodies, that don't investigate as to why and just make decisions and put doormen on doors at a UFO conference. In my experience, it's 34 years. I've had dinner with astronauts. I've addressed the National Press Club. I've spoken at a wing of the United Nations. I've been very honored to travel this world, and I've met them all. But that ain't gonna happen today. But I'm honored I'm up here in Australia with my family, which looks like Glasgow, and it's been an absolute pleasure. Hope you give Peter Robbins a ear. He's my co-author. He's been on a long journey with me for many years, many years. We have the book on sale and the great book that he's just written called Halt in Woodbridge. It's how whistleblowers, and not just me, though it is about me, get treated out in the world. I knew it wouldn't be a fun game. The famous abductee Betty Andreasen told me many years ago in her living room over coffee and coffee cake, I think it was, that if you go forward, it's not going to be a good ride. Well, Betty was 100% right. But I hope you've had a great day. It's an honor to be able to address you from Australia. And please, Peter, bring that Academy Award home to me when you're passing through. And, you know, I want to thank all the gang. And I hope you had a good day. Bless you all. See you at some point in the road.
Larry Warren.
We're living in the age of technology, and you've seen that yourself this evening. That's been tremendous. Just unfortunate that Larry couldn't be with us. But obviously we have his colleague, Peter Robbins is an investigative writer, an author and lecturer best known for his UFO-related papers, columns, articles, editorials, commentaries, lectures and media appearances. He is a regular fixture on radio and has appeared as a guest on and has been consultant to numerous television shows and documentaries. He was born in New York City and studied art, design and theatre at University of Bridgeport in Connecticut, receiving his BFA Painting Film History from New York City School of Visual Arts, SVA. Peter Robbins is a co-author, along with Larry Warren, of the highly acclaimed British bestseller Left at Eastgate, a first-hand account of the Rendlesham Forest UFO incident, its cover-up and investigation. He is also author of Deliberate Deception, a case of disinformation in the UFO research community. The cyber book is available for download at no cost. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm Scottish welcome to Mr. Peter Robbins.
Thank you, and hello, Glasgow. This is the first time I've been back to this great city in 40 years, and it is wonderful to be back here. My only disappointment is your disappointment that my co-author and my dear friend can't be here at my side, but you just saw him briefly, and I'll try to pick up from where he left off. Larry and I worked together initially for 9 years to produce the book Left at Eastgate. It was overall a fascinating and thankless and anxiety-provoking period of time, but we ended up with a book that changed the way that many people in the United Kingdom and the United States see and understand the reality of the UFO situation. Because it happened in a highly militarized context, we not only had witnesses, we had a remarkable paper trail to follow over the years. And what I want to do today is first focus in on the hard evidence, the kind of stuff you could bring in to a court of law, if courts of law had the courage to look at this material, but also to give you an idea of the journey that we took together. And I have to tell you, when Larry and I first met, very, very briefly, it was 1984, only months after he had come forward as not a whistleblower, but the whistleblower in the Rendlesham Forest UFO incident. Whistleblower, for most of us, is a pop cultural word, but it is also a very specific and very real psychological designation. These people are different than the great majority of us. They will literally put their peace of mind, their safety, their livelihoods, sometimes their lives on the line to address a wrong. Why do they do this? I think in many cases it has to do with how they were brought up. Kind of an anti-sort of bullying mentality. I've known Larry's mother for many years, and she and Larry's dad brought up him and his sister and brother with a very real code of morality. I think that Larry had no idea, certainly, that this was going to be his destiny. He was truly an all-American kid, born during the Kennedy administration, loved rock and roll, played hockey, and at a certain point, coming into the end of high school, something happened that changed a fair amount of the political complexion in the world. The Shah of Iran was overthrown, and Khomeini came to power, and the student revolutionaries basically kidnapped the staff of the American Embassy. Many of you remember, others of you are aware of it historically. And that, I think, was the jolt that brought a lot of young people in America into the military. It was enough time after Vietnam that it was considered patriotic and cool to be in the military again. And Larry, who allowed me to interview and re-interview him over the years to a point where I think he used to lay awake at night thinking of ways to kill me, as I did with him on occasion, there were times that we were together for 3 weeks at a clip. And we re-met in 1987 at a very important conference in Washington, D.C., marking the 40th anniversary of Roswell. I heard him speak. I had heard quite a number of people who alleged that they were witnesses to a military UFO incident, or while they were in the service, they were privy to certain information. It's almost always impossible to back this up with factual information. But Larry said he could, and he was a very impressive speaker. And I'll tell you what, to this day I've never met anybody who was angrier about something that happened to them, in his case when he was 19 years old, and the wrongs that were done to other young people who simply were there to serve their country, and at the same time, depending on your point of view, in the very wrong place at the very right moment, during a major, absolutely authentic, truly anomalous series of UFO incursions. Well, when he presented his proposal to me, it was basically, prove me wrong. Do everything you can to prove that I'm a liar, a psycho, a Manchurian candidate, a wannabe. But if you can't, back me up. At this point, I was about a dozen years into UFO investigative work. I was speaking at conferences, I was writing articles that were getting published. The most important thing I was doing through those years, and for many years beyond, was working as the assistant to a wonderful pioneering American researcher in the highly specified area of UFO-related abductions, which I think is the most troubling and most important aspect of what we face with the implications of UFOs. And I was looking for a serious project to get my teeth into, a book-length project. And again, Larry's proposal was really intriguing. It didn't have any aspect or feeling of somebody who was trying to slip one by me, and I'm certainly not naive. And it came down to, if we can do this, if we can write this damn thing, if we can find a publisher and we can publish it, you know, we'll split what we make. I thought I was signing on for a project that maybe was going to take a year or two of my time, was going to cost a couple of $1,000s, bring us back to England, you know, look authentic, walk the walk, and that I would probably spend the rest of my life endorsing checks and just trying to keep up with all the women who, I'll leave it at that. It didn't work out like that. 9 years later, and between us 15 trips to England, we came out with a book that was published in the United States by a mediocre publisher, who we are convinced kept 2 sets of books, and when we confronted them in court, they declared bankruptcy, and that was that. However, here in the UK, we had a terrific publisher, a small press, Michael O'Mara Press, in London. They believed in us. They helped us put together a 1-month, 15-city speaking tour that took us over a good portion of the UK, and things changed after that. So, to begin our story, let's go back to 1980. Larry Warren has enlisted in the United States Air Force, and he has been stationed at RAF Bentwaters. But going back a bit earlier. Ministry of Defense standard sign, some of you may have seen these around military bases. They're serious, they mean business. And I remember very, very well in February 1988 when we made our first trip to Suffolk, and we're sort of casing RAF Bentwaters, the base he was assigned to, 8 years earlier. And he said, come on. I said, no, we can't. That sign is very clear. He says, I'll ignore the sign. I visualized landmines, automatic gunfire. Larry visualized getting from point A to point B. I followed him. And I violated a number of these signs over the years and getting to where we needed to go to do the work that we felt we had to do. To give you an idea of the location, that large blue dot, most of you know, is Suffolk, East Anglia. I use this map in the States because Americans are map challenged. That small red dot is a city called London, and we are about 70 or so miles northeast of London. Right, this gives you a slightly better location idea. RAF Bentwaters was established as an American Army Air Corps base during World War II, and the American presence remained there until the base was decommissioned about 1992. RAF Woodbridge has been an RAF base straight through, very involved in recovery or anything where a ship is in danger. We're only about 6 miles from the coast here. RAF Woodbridge was decommissioned briefly in the 90s and then reopened. I believe it has a standing manpower there right now of about 5,000 RAF. Okay, can I get a laser pointer from somebody in the technical department? What we have here is a more or less a close-up map of the area of activity, so to say. This is the RAF Woodbridge landing area, which is the longest landing strip still to this day in all of Europe. Straight north of it, you see RAF Bentwaters, 2 landing sites. Now, that giant red dot has to do with the location of the event Larry was involved in on the 3rd night of activity. Let me say here and now, before it gets confusing, the so-called Rendlesham Forest UFO incident, previously referred to as the Bentwaters UFO incident, earlier on, all right, thank you. Earlier on known as the Woodbridge Lights, was a series of UFO incursions events that occurred over 3 consecutive nights in late December between Christmas and New Year's. And again, Larry's event happened in a farmer's field called Capel Green, just as location again, RAF Bentwaters, RAF Woodbridge. Okay, just a little more of a close-up. And a very welcoming welcome sign, I think. Yeesh. Several backstories inform the UFO story, and I think they're terribly important. One of the things I try to do in my research and investigation is get folks, smart people, who are challenged by the subject, maybe a bit anxious about it, through that first door, into the lobby, so to say. And I try to do that at times by couching the actual events that are anomalous smack dab in the middle of post-war history, which is what I'm going to do here. At the time of these events, the UFO incursion, we had a major world political situation going on. And if you were at the time, well, I should say first, RAF Bentwaters, among other things, was a spy plane launch location. In the 50s and the 60s, they were launching our U-2s out of RAF Bentwaters. Then they moved on to the SR-71, the Blackbird. I've seen a number of these planes over the years in air museums. And last week, a week ago today, I was in Cleveland, Ohio, giving a talk on Rendlesham. And 2 days before that, friends took me to the famous Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, home of the legendary Hangar 18, which for some reason they were not interested in showing me. But Larry and I, on our first visit to England, we were in the woods, just getting a better sense of the territory, completely unaware that a very rare daylight launch of one of these highly classified spy planes was about to happen off of the secured runway, one for normal traffic, one for not normal. And this thing came roaring over our head. To this day, it's the loudest aircraft I have ever heard and the most aerodynamically beautiful. My first thought was if sharks could fly. The design is flawless. Also something to keep in mind. You know, we talk about back engineering, where we may be in terms of technology in the first world. This is 1950s, 50 technology. It was designed by a legendary aircraft designer named Kelly Johnson, who worked for the Lockheed Skunk Works, so to say, in California and Nevada. It was field tested at Area 51. We now know that these were deployed during the Kennedy administration in the early 60s. They could climb at 10,000 feet a minute. They could travel at Mach 3, 3 times the speed of sound. The skin was titanium, and it leaked fuel to such a degree until it was at high performance level that as it was getting up into the stratosphere, it would glow orange. It looked like it was completely on fire. A small scandal about 15 years ago at an air show here in the UK, where a photographer got it looking like it was completely on fire. Her Majesty's government and the Americans were not happy. You should also be aware this is a spy plane. There isn't a weapon on it unless the pilot or co-pilot is carrying a sidearm. And they had the state-of-the-art Hasselblad cameras that could indeed photograph license plates in the Soviet Union from 60,000 feet up. This is 1950s technology. Where are we today? Take your best guess. Are the Americans stealth fighters and the stealth bombers were flying out of RAF Bentwaters before Americans knew they even existed. Also, this thing, which we'll get back to later, which is very involved in the story I'm about to tell you, also flew out of this area, but not from our base. Right. December of 1980, late December, you go to any major newspaper in this country, you look at the big international story around Christmas time, and there was one looming. It was Soviet concern over a growing pro-democracy movement emanating out of the Gdansk shipyards in Poland. There was concern that if it progressed to a point where the Soviets felt it was not manageable, they might try to pull what they did in Hungary in 1956 and roll in there. What we in America and you in the UK and everybody else in civilian land did not know was that week, and again this is part of the backstory of Rendlesham, the Soviets had massed more than 100,000 crack troops, infantry and armored, on their border with Poland. If the situation in their mind got out of control, they were ready to roll into Poland. The Americans were pledged to come in on the side of the Polish people. All of our bases in Europe and in the UK were on red alert. Red is one step below black, and black is war. On the third night, the one that Larry was involved in, he was being assigned to guard duty with deflight of the security cops. And before you go on guard duty, you go through a process called guard mount. Needless to say, your senses cannot be in an altered state when you are on guard duty in a military facility. If any of these men had had an over-the-counter cold pill that afternoon, or a sip of beer, nothing personal, but you're off shift. That night, and only that night, they were told that there was, in so many words, a very tiny chance, very small, that crack Spetsnaz Soviet special paratrooper troops might be dropped into England that night, signaling the beginning of World War III. That's the kind of tension that this UFO story happened against. Then there's the broader problem, and again, very quickly, Gdansk shipyard. The unknown electrician at the time, who was the head of this pro-democracy movement, a gentleman named Lech Walesa, who I think all of you know went on to become the first democratically elected president of Poland. Soviet tanks, but in the background there was a bigger problem. By virtue of the United States treaty with Her Majesty's government at that time, and I don't know if it's the case, I hope it is, we were not supposed to have nuclear ordnance in your country. However, we did. And not only did we, and that is a tactical nuclear device, to use the euphemism. Not only did we, but we had the largest backline repository of nuclear weapons in NATO, stored in the weapons storage area of RAF Bentwaters in Suffolk in East Anglia. This is the story that the UFO story happened against. This photograph, the series of photographs, I waited 25 years to take. Had I tried to get a photograph like this when Larry and I first started working on this book in the late 80s, I might be getting out of a military prison right about now. This is the nuclear weapons storage area in RAF Bentwaters, known as the Hot Row. We were only able to get in here because we had the good fortune of working with a Canadian film team about 3 years ago. And they had paid, by the way, the whole RAF Bentwaters is now privately owned. It's being developed for different purposes in different areas. But if you want to shoot a film there, you know, work there in terms of using kind of this military ghost town as a background, 1,500 pounds a day will get you in too. But Larry had been in here a number of times. It is an area within the base, double ring of barbed wire, shoot to kill zones, automatic weapons, dogs, the whole 9 yards. And if that weren't enough, you see way at the end of the Hot Row, kind of this burnt orange building there, that's as nasty a location, if not nastier, than the nukes. I'll get to that in a moment. On the first night, unknowns were observed from the 80-foot high tower, observation tower within the weapons storage area. At the same time, a guard at the east gate of RAF Woodbridge, a law enforcement police officer, Air Force police officer, observed a light go down in the woods. Now, it was a temperate night, no moon, no ambient light. There was so much moisture in the air. I mean, normally, like right now, I'm going to shine this laser and it hits right there. We see it, but we don't see a red line going to it. If we were in a steam room or an area with a great deal of moisture in the air, we would see that line. It would be catching on billions of droplets of water. That night, unknowns came in over the nuclear weapons storage area. They were not shot down. They shone, I guess what we now call like industrial laser type lights, down into the weapons storage area. And I can tell you for a fact, coming from the former deputy base commander, who I have a lot of disagreements with, but don't think is an evil guy. He's between a rock and a hard place. He told Larry and I and a colleague of ours to our faces, and you can read about it in Left at Eastgate or in Halton Woodbridge, that somehow those beams of light adversely affected the ordnance. Let the chill of that phrase sink in. And this is not an isolated event. Some people wonder why the whole UFO phenomena kicked off in earnest outside of a tiny little town in New Mexico called Roswell. Because at the time, the Roswell Army Airfield, this is still a number of weeks before the United States Air Force comes into existence, was the home of the 509th Bomb Wing. The 509th was the only nuclear strike force in the world in 1947. I think it's fair to say that there was an interest on the part of them about us with that. And there is a history of UFO and nuclear incursions. A colleague named Robert Hastings some years ago published a book called UFOs and Nukes. It's as big as Left at Eastgate, it's over 500 pages, and it gives you the real deal. Right, that little building at the end there that looks like a really nasty tract house. It went by several names, but to be blunt, it is the biotoxin storage area. Of course, it's against the Geneva Convention for any of our countries to have biological weapons. At the time, the Americans knew the Soviets had weaponized anthrax and other horrific chemical and biological weapons, so we had to have them. It's a crazy world, isn't it? And that is where they were stored. I have rarely had, we talk about some of the wonderful talks we've had today. Haunted places. This is spookier than any haunted place you can imagine. And we got in, it's stripped, but it's a pretty chilling location. So, while these beams of light are being shown into the weapons storage area, a man named John Burroughs, standing guard at the east gate of RAF Woodbridge, observes a reddish light go down into the woods. There's no hint of an explosion. There's no ground concussion. There's no fire. There's no anything except this is a militarized area, and you now know the backstory. It had to be investigated. He calls in. He is joined by a sergeant named Jim Peniston, who is a security cop. Two kinds of police. Law enforcement, like John, kind of the equivalent of, police constables on the street. And then like Jim and like Larry, the security police, who are the paramilitary ones. They're the ones who shoot first, ask questions later. And they are driven out into the forested area by another security cop named Ed Cabanasac, who takes the vehicle as far as it can go, and they walk in from there. This is probably the most famous story in the Rendlesham saga because it's been the subject of more television documentaries and treatments than Larry's event, for example. And both Jim and John agree that they walked into this area of forest and they encountered first a ferocious static electricity charge in the air, absolutely ferocious, which Larry and the men he was with encountered 2 nights later. They then observe a thing, obviously a craft, not terribly large, maybe 7 feet or so, of which this is one artist's rendition. Good luck on communicating to a television artist a recreation of the wildest moment in your life. I've seen different depictions, they do their best, but they walked up to it. Jim says that he observed symbols, whatever you want to call them, letter forms, hieroglyphics, on the side of this thing, and he copied them out into his personal field notebook, not an official Air Force notebook. John, who is right there, has no memory of this at all. Missing time enters into this story, and a number of the men, including Larry, at certain points do not know how they got from point A to point B. Well, Jim and John have to report this, and I think I'd be right there with them. This is a military situation. They are in for the long haul, and both of them served their country for their full shift. I think one of them 20 years, the other one a little less than that. And there was no way they wanted this on their permanent military record. So they gave kind of a sanitized version. The deputy base commander, who was somewhat skeptical, who enters into the story in quite a large way, went out the next day with a number of other men, including them. They measured the area. They found the area where this thing had sat. There were impressions in the soil. They took plaster casts. They took radiation readings. And we're talking about microscopic beta and gamma count background readings. And this is not my stat, it's the Ministry of Defense's, but it was 10 times the amount that you'd expect and that you found in the normal area. Again, very minor, but 10 times minor is worth noticing. Right. On the second night, I'll go back a second, there were more observations, more of these things came down, and where they touched up against organic material, be it a tree or soil, it really messed with the structure of the organic material, which is very exciting potentially for investigators because you have something you can really establish happened there beyond any reasonable doubt. For me, the most poignant event on the second night was the only woman that we know who was directly involved in these events. Sergeant Bonnie Tamplin was out in this general area, sitting in the cab of a military truck, and a phenomena that we now refer to as an orb. This light form, I don't know whether they're alive. It's completely theoretical as to why they're here, what they're about. When I first started to hear about them, to digress for a moment, as a photographer, I thought, lens flare, light catching within the lens structure and showing it, or a reflection off of glass or something. But I have now photographed them in the Rendlesham Forest when there was absolutely nothing there to see. So, as Tony Soprano would say, what are you going to do? Anyway, she basically had a bit of a breakdown. This thing flew into the cab and started flying around, and the result was she was removed from active duty. She's never made a comment on it. I only wish her well. On the third night, remember again, these events are happening right between Christmas and New Year's. And there is a round of parties going on off base for the officers and their husbands, their wives, whomever. And Charles Hall and Malcolm Ziegler, who's in charge of the security cops, and quite a number of other mucky-mucks on the base, are at a particular party. And a Sergeant Bruce England, who worked closely with Charles Hall, comes up to him at the party and says, they're back. Well, again, Hall was something of a skeptic, and who wouldn't want to see for themselves? He goes back to his residence, he changes out of his evening clothes into field clothes, he pulls together a contingent of men, about 6 as I recall, and we know who they are. Some of you that have seen clips of this or heard clips of Halt's experience on documentaries, I can assure you they are authentic. This is not some kind of fake studio recording. Mr. Hall had a micro-cassette recorder with him that night. I traveled with one in each pocket for years doing research, and they served me well. And they're out in the woods, not far from where Jim and John's event happened, and not far from where Larry Warren, Adrian Bustinza, and the men they were with event was going to happen not long after this. And a UFO passes over their head, fairly close. One of the witnesses described it like an eye. And as it came over them, it shone a beam of light very close down to their feet. Enter Larry Warren. Larry, like so many guys of his generation, my generation, your generation, grew up loving rock and roll music. Favorite groups, The Who, loved the whole British invasion, had studied in England in his junior year of high school. He was on an exchange program, Billericay's in the South. And so when he decided to enlist in the Air Force, it was a time where you could get your country of choice. You basically made a contract with the Air Force. If you train me to be a truck driver or a cop or a radio operator, I will do that job. If I break my agreement, you can sue me for separation. If you break yours, I can do the same. Larry decided he wanted to be a security police officer and received specialty training in Lackland Air Force Base in Texas, where he went through his basic training the summer of 1980. This is him graduating with his class at the Lackland Air Force Base Security Police Academy. And I believe that is his smiling face right there. Okay, that is what the sign that we looked at the beginning looked like in 1980. They'd never repainted it. This piece of paperwork is called an in-processing sheet. And I don't want to bore you with a lot of paperwork, but there are people who, when I started to work with him, said he wasn't even there. And if he was there, he wasn't qualified. He would have had to have X number of weeks training, and he didn't have it, so he's a liar. Well, he was telling the truth. This is dated December 2nd, the day after he arrived. He already has his badge number. He is posted to the duty roster on D flight, starting the 10th of December. And intro training commenced 2 days later, basically on-the-job training. He was assigned his M16 automatic weapon. He went through PRP. He had his PRP, which is Personal Reconnaissance Pledge, and he was on duty. 2 days before this, every American on the base was affected by just a terrible, insane thing that happened in my hometown, New York City, when a crazy man shot John Lennon to death. And that very first weekend, Larry and a lot of the guys went to Liverpool for a huge benefit, a huge memorial service. It was either Liverpool or London, I'm sorry if I forget at the moment. But you know, when you do this kind of research, you look for the smallest things. And Larry had mentioned to me at one point that Life magazine, which for me as a kid growing up was the standard. It was a time capsule every week. I don't even know what the equivalent publication would be here in the UK, but that Life had featured a huge photograph, I think a 2-page spread, of like 100,000 plus people in this huge plaza. And again, it was either Liverpool or London. And Larry said, I had got myself on a lamppost so I could see what was going on, and I'm in that picture. I got myself a copy of Life magazine. I went into it with my 10-power loop, and there he is, right where he said he was. Okay. On the given night, Larry is posted out to perimeter, and this is the main gate of RAF Bentwaters. Just go, okay. On the given night, Larry was posted to a location called Perimeter Post 18. It was an old pillbox. Some of you are familiar with them. They dot the east coast of the United Kingdom. They're 1, 2, 3 person fortifications built in advance of what we felt might be the German invasion, 1940-41. That night, very unusually, every single guard post around the base was being manned. Usually it wasn't like that. People have said, oh, everybody was talking about it on base. Well, they weren't. They were told not to talk about it after the first 2 nights, guys, and they weren't. On the 3rd night, Larry had been on furlough for 2 nights, and he returns to the base, was not aware of this. Go on guard mount, assigned to guard duty, weapon, Motorola radio, your little meal, which they referred to affectionately as bag nasties. And he's listening on his radio as guys further down the line are making kind of nervous jokes about the lights that they're seeing hanging close to the horizon. Because of Larry's position, he was unable to see them. But a more senior person then came on the radio and said, you know, quit that chatter. Shortly thereafter, Larry was ordered to shut down his post and told he's going to be picked up by military vehicle for another assignment. Pickup truck pulls up shortly thereafter, driven by Lieutenant Bruce England. In it is Adrian Bustinza, a sergeant in D Flight, who was with Charles Hall and those men earlier in the evening, and who is now going to be heading into the Twilight Zone, standing right next to Larry. Well, they take the vehicles to the base motor pool, where they hook up light-alls. Light-alls are gas-operated Klieg lights that a lot of us associate with the old-fashioned Hollywood premieres. The tanks are topped off, they're checked. A cordon of vehicles heads to the main gate. It's now after midnight, and they head off into the night. In the course of leaving the base, they committed a relatively minor treaty violation compared to a nuclear treaty violation, which is this. If you are an American in the military stationed in Great Britain, it's just fine to have a loaded automatic weapon on the base, but that's where it remains. And they left that base with fully loaded automatic weapons. Drive through the night, go about 5 miles past the main, this would be the East Gate Road as it looked then. It's almost a mile down to East Gate, and off to the right there, you see RAF Woodbridge. They passed the gate and then made a left on a logging road into the Rendlesham Forest. Now, the title of our book is a conjugation, left at East Gate, of making that left turn after East Gate. But as Larry very poignantly pointed out to me some years later, it had a double meaning. These men were literally, thanks so much, Barry, left at Eastgate. Well, this is what the logging road looked like some years ago when these two wonderful dogs were alive. Jack and Bob, rest their souls. That gate was not there. The military vehicles went about halfway down that logging road, which is about a mile. You come to a point where it widens, and that is where the vehicles pulled in. An armorer's truck, basically a pickup truck with racks welded on the back, pulled in as well. All of the weapons were collected, which I think in retrospect was a good thing. The men were then broken up into 3-man groups. Each group assigned a radio, told to head in that direction, due east, and investigate a disturbance. And so they head into the forest. Larry said after walking a very short distance, they felt a static electricity charge in the air that was so ferocious. The only way he could explain it to me, it's not like rubbing a party balloon on your arm and watching the hair go up. He said, he reminded me that the security cops wore berets. And although these were highly trained military specialists, they were between 18 and 22 years old. They were young guys with healthy heads of hair. And he said our hair was pushing the berets off our heads. That's a lot of static electricity. Then they hear the sound of somebody crying, and they come upon a man, security cop, who is in a semi-fetal position, backed up to a tree trunk, crying, with another person trying to offer some comfort. They move past him, and they get to the point where the forest starts to open and you see the field. And we're going to go over some important landmarks here. That's the farmer's house over there, about 100 yards from where this photo was taken. There was a light on the second floor. Whoever lived there was watching what these men were encountering. This is the front of a stand of trees. And the incident Larry was involved in happened literally between where I'm taking this picture and that stand of trees. Right about there, close. Okay, once again, we have entered the forest this way, and there's the point of the stand of trees, there's the farmer's house, there's the second field. Jim and John's event, as I recall, happened right about here, and Charles Halt and the men he was with on the third night before Larry and the men he was with had their event happened probably just beyond the frame. Okay, another view. Once again, the event would have occurred here. Now, they come through into this wooded area. Meanwhile, they're bringing these light-alls as well as they can, because there's a barn and a wire fence trying to get them into the field, but none of them will work. The engines were tested half an hour earlier at the motor pool. None of them would turn over. Radios are having problems, flashlights are having problems. When they entered the field and looked left, saw this beautiful oak tree, which for Larry was a landmark location. And 8 years and 2 months after this night, when we first went out there, for me, I knew this tree when I saw it. I started my professional life as a painter. It's all I ever wanted to do, and I was lucky. I had encouraging adults. I was gifted as a kid. From 5 or 6 years old, that was my dream. Until, I was living it. I went to the best art school in America. I was on their faculty for a dozen years. I was starting to sell my work. I was emerging as a young painter of interest in the art scene. And then my whole life went to hell on a certain level when a memory returned from childhood of a profoundly unambiguous UFO sighting I'd had with my sister Helen. And 14 years passed before I spoke to her about it. It became, if I have other repressed memories from childhood, I don't remember them. I guess that's a stupid thing to say. But this memory took 14 years to emerge, and when it did, I was shattered. How could something like this happen and you forget about it? Well, that's the way the mind works sometimes. And I thought it all out before I called my sister. She verified it, which was rather exciting, and then said, but there's more, and you're not going to like it. And then years before I became involved in abduction research, she described to me archetypical memories from childhood. One of them associated with that day of being taken, being brought on board, raised, being returned, and my career trolley jumped the tracks, and I was furious. Something more important had been thrown in the road, and I became obsessed with it immediately. What happened to my sister, and what the hell is going on? And here I am, 40 years later, not showing my work in galleries, but being up here talking to you. Anyway, the reason I mention it is Larry, who grew up with a very artistic mother, and he's got an awful lot of appreciation for culture. It's fun to go to museums with him and things. About 10 years ago, spontaneously, simply started to paint. Wonderfully, what we call naive painting. It's an established school, and he's gotten really sophisticated in his work, and he goes through periods of time where he just goes on automatic and paints. This is a fairly early one, and it's very much an impressionistic. When they walked into the field, they didn't encounter a craft. They encountered a ground fog, 30 or 40 feet across, oval in shape, grayish yellow, self-illuminated. I mean, this is real Twilight Zone territory, and they were ordered to surround it. And several dozen men did just that. But again, I especially like this painting because he captures the tree, and even though the fog would have been on the other side, it tells the story. Now that red light next enters into it. These men are surrounding this phenomena, and they observe, coming in high from the direction of the North Sea, a reddish light. You and I can only imagine what it must have been like to not just observe it coming in, but then observe it coming in over the farmer's field, and then observe it coming in directly over this ground fog. I think it's fair to say, in terms of deductive reasoning, that all eyes were on it. When 40 feet or so up, above the ground fog, it exploded with no noise, but with such magnesium brightness. Larry described it as a wall of flash bulbs going off. Now, you've got to be a certain age to appreciate that, because one or two people in here may be saying, what's a flash bulb? If you are, leave. You're too young. He was temporarily blinded. Again, I am guessing other men were as well. And when his eyes and the other men's eyes adjusted, sitting in the ground fog was a fully articulated, structured craft. Again, very much an impression. Several different drawings that he's done over the years, he said it was not that compact, but put yourself in my place for a moment. 40 years into this work, how many people do you think have come up to me and said, let me tell you about the thing that I saw, and maybe describe the shape of the anomalous phenomena? I have no idea, certainly hundreds and hundreds. But one of the things that stuck in my mind with the Capel Green craft was whenever Larry described it or drew it, it had these, it kind of tucked under at the edges. There were 3 deltas, those and one coming right out at us. But they did that thing rather than just be a disc, and it stuck in my mind. This is Larry's impression of what it might have looked like if we were looking down on it. And I should say that when it appeared, a number of the men in that cordon just ran off. I think I would have been leading that group. Again, these are military people, most of them stood their ground. And this is where I think it's important to remember that these men had intentionally had their weapons removed. Can you imagine? If any of you have seen that wonderful American B science fiction standard, the original, not to be confused with the remake ever, The Day the Earth Stood Still, when dear Klaatu comes down from the saucer and pulls this device out of his pocket for the President of the United States, that he can communicate with his leader, he is very quickly shot. And these men were standing in a circle. Wouldn't have been a pretty picture. So, Larry is here, Adrian is here. There are cameramen on location. They are filming with film cameras. They are filming with video. It's 1980. You couldn't mistake a video camera. It was very bulky technology. single lens reflex cameras. 2 police constables from Woodbridge wander into the area with a camera. They are escorted out and their film is removed. In fact, they are held for a period of time and then released. Okay, Larry did this drawing for me in my living room several months before we did our first trip to England in February of '88, and I made my notes after, just to give me kind of a lay of the land. This would have basically been the line where the forest meets the field. The base, RAF Woodbridge, is 2 miles that way. The craft, as if seen from above, points where men would have been. And as they're watching it, and again, Larry is here, Adrian is here, they observe a glow on the far side. And the glow starts to move slowly. And I have to stress here, they were not 100 or 200 yards away. They were not 200 feet away. They were like 20 feet away. They were close. And as the glow comes around here, they see within the glow, as it passes that delta, and they can see it clearly, 3 distinct shapes within the glow. Larry, who can be extremely modest, he says, you think that part where I wrote about this is really great, I'm not so impressed by it. I am, and I'm a professional writer. His description of that moment when the shapes become discernible within the glow, for me, is absolutely chilling. His reaction, call it shock, call it denial, call it survival response, was, what are children doing out here? This is a military situation. I don't have to tell you that they were not children, but they were 3 humanoid type entities. They were not skinny and emaciated, looking like your archetypical gray alien that's so ubiquitous in popular culture. They were more stocky. They were between 3 and 4 feet tall. Each one was wearing what seemed to be a form-fitting garment. They were floating about the foot off the ground, and they were slightly translucent. You could see light coming through them. Nice. And they just stood there, or they just floated there. At about this point, a staff car comes down the road, and it stops about there because there's no way a vehicle can get into the field because of the barren and the wire fence. And an officer named Gordon Williams, Colonel Gordon Williams, steps out, the base wing commander, in evening clothes, having just come from the party. And he walks out into that field, and he walks through the cordon of men. Fairly big guy, well, compared to me, that's not hard. About 6'3". And again, when you investigate anomalous material, it's kind of easy to get caught up in the romance and the coolness sometimes, if that's what drives you. But the most important telling events sometimes are the most tiny human ones. Not some grand detail that somebody might work up to, make it seem more impressive, but a small human moment or a small non-human moment. These things are 3 or 4 feet tall. They're floating a foot off the ground. Gordon Williams is 6'3". They're now about 10 or 12 feet apart. And he looks at them, and Larry said, as if they were one being, all 3 of them at the same moment went like this. Now, this is where a certain amount of nonsense gets investigated into this story. It is disinformation. It would be funny if it wasn't so destructive to the truth or sending people off on different trails. It disturbed me, and it still disturbs me, that there are aspects of what happened to these men that lead me to believe there is a possibility that the United States Air Force had an idea of what they were sending these men into, which in itself is extremely unnerving. However, part of the rumor mill was that they shook hands, there was overt communication, we gave them a candy bar, they were there to have the Air Force help them repair their craft because we had a part. I mean, total and complete bull. At a certain point, Sergeant Bobby Ball, Robert Ball, the senior NCO on location, starts to move around the outside of the circle of men. And I should say also earlier, before the beings appear, he comes up to Larry and Adrian and orders them in to come closer to look with him. And they come within about 5 feet of the craft and then slowly back off. Well, at this point, he's going around the circle and he's tapping every third guy with the understanding that they head back to the logging road and back to the staging area. Larry is tapped out in the second to last group. He stops at that point where the forest meets the field, turns around, fixes the scene in his head. And I can only report on third-hand anecdotal reference how the event resolved. With a small number of men there, at a certain point, the beings disappeared. They didn't go in a door in the craft, they simply were not there anymore, and I think we can assume they got back in. The craft rose, the apparatus, the tripod kind of landing thing came up, it tipped slightly, was making a slight humming sound, and within a moment was no bigger than a star. End of the event. For years, like Jim and John, saying, you know, we remember this, that, and the other thing, Larry said, I got home, we went home on the vehicles, and, you know, we were told to shut up about it. I was wondering if this was happening all over the world. You know, could this be the beginning of a mass invasion? And he was asking the other guys what they thought after he had been told not to talk about it, not to ask about it. His problem was that he put the truth before orders, and he's paid a price for it ever since. Well, he has no memory of how the hell he got back to his dormitory room, but he woke up there and had kind of a metallic taste in his mouth. His eyes hurt. He said he could literally hear it when he blinked. And as soon as possible, he went to the base medical facility and made an appointment to have an eye exam. We'll get back to that shortly. Okay, the next morning, once again in violation of military regulations and what they had been ordered to do, he and one of his buddies, who had also been a witness, another cop on D flag, Greg Battram, they go to a base phone where Larry calls his mother. What we used to call a transatlantic call, reverse the charges. Larry and his mom had had several UFO sighting incidents themselves together when he was growing up. He was not a total stranger to this, which at the time would have been seen as outrageous. The way that the research community felt about subjects like that or about abduction at the time, and the time here is the 80s, it would be the equivalent of being hit by lightning. If it happened to you, it was only going to happen once. Now we know just the opposite. People that go through this abduction phenomena, it can happen on and off throughout a good part of your life. It may well happen to one of your kids. It likely happened to one of your parents. For whatever reasons we can only guess at, they follow bloodlines. Anyway, he's starting to talk, and the phone goes dead, and he calls the operator and asks, he says, I was cut off, and the operator very nicely asks him if he was cut off, is he on the base? He said, yes. He said, well, sir, you were cut off by base facility. Hangs up the phone, looks at Greg, says a rude thing, and goes back to his residence and waits to be contacted. Head of law enforcement calls him in, sits down opposite him at the table. Major Ziegler, who I think was a very good guy handling the situation the best he could with his men, said, you know, we told you guys not to talk about this, and, you know, you called your family. And Larry looked at him and he lied, and he said, no, I didn't. And Ziegler opened that large lower drawer, reel-to-reel tape recorder, pushes the button, there's the call. He says, look, I appreciate what you guys went through. It's totally stressed you out in so many words. I'm not going to throw the book at you. However, you have a choice. You can take a modest fine. We'll subtract money every month. And, you know, I think it was $300 in total, or you lose your stripes. And Larry felt he'd never get to be airman first class again if he did, so he took the fine. The men who were involved were then brought later that afternoon into a debriefing, which